the mid-1980s, the city of San Diego sat at a crossroads of beauty and violence. On the surface, it was a postcard: palm trees, beaches, and bright California skies. But beneath that calm exterior, something darker was growing. Street gangs, forged in the prisons of California, ruled the neighborhoods with brutal authority. And among them, one name would rise from the alleys of the city to the highest ranks of organized crime: Ronnie Ayala. Ronnie Ayala wasn't born into power. He earned it the hard way, through discipline, intelligence, and an uncanny ability to read people. Those who knew him in his youth remember a man who was both magnetic and intimidating, quiet, methodical, and absolutely certain of his place in the world he intended to conquer. By the time Ayala reached adulthood, the Mexican Mafia, La M.I., had become the invisible government of California's criminal underworld. It ruled both prison yards and the streets, commanding respect through fear and enforcing order through blood. For young gangsters on the outside, joining La M.I. was like being knighted into a criminal elite. And for Ayala, it was more than membership. It was destiny. Ayala's reputation grew quickly in San Diego's gang circles. He was known as someone who didn't flinch under pressure, someone who could organize, plan, and execute with precision. But it was a triple homicide in 1985 that would define him and seal his fate. That year, 3 men were found shot execution style inside a small auto repair shop in San Diego. The killings were cold and calculated. Every shot delivered at close range, every victim silenced without warning. Detectives described the scene as professional, efficient, and deeply personal. It wasn't random. It was a message. When the investigation began to unfold, Ronnie Ayala's name appeared at the center of it. Witnesses were terrified to talk. Rumors spread that the murders had been ordered to enforce discipline, a punishment for disloyalty or betrayal. In the world Ayala lived in, such acts weren't seen as senseless. They were policy. After a tense 4-year investigation and trial in 1989, the verdict came down. Ronnie Ayala was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to die. For prosecutors, it was justice. For Ayala, it was just another step up the ladder. When the gates of San Quentin State Prison closed behind him, Ayala entered a world unlike any other, a world where killers, gang leaders, and lifers coexisted under the shadow of the death chamber. But even in that darkness, power could still be earned, and Ayala intended to claim it. Death row is a paradox, the state's most secure facility, yet one of its most connected. Letters, coded notes, and whispers move through the system like currency. Within weeks, Ayala began studying everything: the guards' routines, the mail systems, how contraband entered, and who controlled which yard. He was patient, observant, and never impulsive. The death sentence didn't slow him down. It focused him. If he couldn't rule the streets in person, he'd rule them by proxy. By the early 1990s, fellow inmates had begun referring to him as El Jefe, the boss. He wasn't the loudest man in the cell block. He didn't need to be. In the Mexican Mafia, power doesn't come from volume. It comes from respect and the fear of what happens when you lose it. Ayala began to build a network from his cell. Messages left San Quentin, disguised as letters to family members or coded religious notes. Orders were filtered through wives, girlfriends, and secretaries, women outside the walls who moved money and handled logistics. Each order was precise. Each act carried his invisible signature. Authorities first noticed the pattern in gang violence across San Diego, Riverside, and Sacramento. Incidents that seemed unrelated shared the same origin. directives from someone inside San Quentin. Every killing, every extortion threat, every drug deal connected back to Ayala's growing influence. To his followers, he was more than a man on death row. He was a symbol of power, a living legend. They called him La Voz del Muro, the voice of the wall. It was whispered that Ayala's reach extended beyond prison walls, that his word could start wars or end them. Law enforcement didn't want to believe it at first. How could a condemned inmate, someone awaiting execution, be controlling criminal operations across multiple cities? But as they dug deeper, they found evidence. Smuggled letters, financial records, coded instructions. Each thread led back to Ronnie Ayala's cell. What they uncovered was more than a communication system. It was a chain of command. On the outside, his associates collected money from gang crews, sold drugs on his behalf, and funneled profits through networks of relatives and girlfriends. On the inside, Ayala maintained control through fear and reputation. He disciplined his own soldiers, rewarded loyalty, and punished betrayal. Inside San Quentin, Ayala mastered the art of invisible leadership. He learned to move pieces without touching them, to issue death sentences with nothing more than a message written in ink. His life became a contradiction. A man condemned to die, yet commanding life and death for others. The irony was staggering. The state's harshest punishment, that meant to end his power, had instead amplified it. San Quentin had become his headquarters, death row his office, and his sentence his shield. Inmates came and went. Gang leaders rose and fell. But Ayala remained, unmovable, untouchable, and increasingly dangerous. Each year, his influence grew. He found ways to connect, not just to La Ime members inside other prisons, but to street gangs in San Diego, Los Angeles, and even northern cities like Seattle. Every connection strengthened his web of control. By the late 1990s, Ayala's power reached a level few inmates could match. He no longer relied on violence alone. His authority was psychological. His followers didn't obey because they were afraid. They obeyed because they believed. Behind the walls of San Quentin, Ronnie Ayala had achieved what seemed impossible. He turned a death sentence into a career. He transformed isolation into influence, and he began to redefine what it meant to lead the Mexican Mafia in the modern era. As the new millennium approached, a question began to haunt law enforcement and rival gang leaders alike. If a man on death row could run an empire from a cage, what would stop him from expanding it even further? In the next chapter, Ayala's reach would stretch far beyond California's prisons. From behind bars, he would forge an alliance with one of the most powerful drug cartels in the world, and turn death row into the command center of an international criminal enterprise. Death row is supposed to be the end of the line, a place where time stands still, where every inmate counts down to a final date that may never come. But for Ronnie Ayala, it was the beginning of something far greater. From within the concrete confines of San Quentin, he began to construct an empire that blurred the boundaries between prison and street, between life and death. For most prisoners, confinement meant silence, but Ayala turned silence into strategy. Over years of isolation, he built what federal investigators later called a command structure in exile. It was a network that stretched from California's toughest prisons to the barrios of Southern California, and even across the border into Mexico. At its core was one simple idea: control. Control of information, control of people, control of the flow of money and drugs. And Ayala achieved it with a weapon more powerful than a gun: communication. Every message that left his cell was a calculated move. Letters appeared to be prayers, poems, or family correspondence, but hidden within them were orders, instructions on who to tax, who to trust, and who to eliminate. His followers called them reglas del muro, rules from the wall. Each one carried his signature authority. Outside prison, these messages triggered a chain reaction. Gangs from San Diego to Los Angeles began to align under Ayala's directives. Rival crews stopped fighting each other and started working together, united by a single unseen hand. For law enforcement, it was like watching smoke move through a maze. Impossible to pin down, impossible to stop. They knew the orders were coming from death row, but they couldn't prove how. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to show violence. When Ayala spoke or wrote, people moved. That's real power. That's the kind of influence you don't earn overnight. That's something you build through fear and respect. By the early 2000s, Ayala's reach had become undeniable. His network funneled narcotics from Mexican cartel suppliers through prison contacts and street intermediaries. Small neighborhood gangs became his distributors. Every deal that took place in San Diego's South Bay, in National City, in Chula Vista, a piece of it flowed back to him. Investigators later discovered that Ayala's lieutenants had even forged direct lines of communication with cartel operators in Baja California, exchanging information and resources. These alliances gave Ayala something few inmates had ever achieved: international influence. Through these relationships, drugs entered California prisons and money flowed out, all while Ayala remained locked in a cell no larger than a bathroom. He never touched a weapon, never handled the product, but his word alone could set the gears of his empire turning. The Mexican Mafia had always been feared, but under Ayala's guidance, it became organized in a way that resembled a corporation. There were departments, roles, taxes, and protocols. Everyone owed tribute, from street soldiers to independent dealers. Those who refused to pay were labeled green-lighted, marked for death. Ayala enforced his laws with mathematical precision. He didn't kill for emotion. He killed for structure. But even the most disciplined system leaves traces. In 2005, during a coordinated sweep across California prisons, investigators intercepted dozens of letters written in Ayala's distinct hand. When decoded, they revealed orders for assaults, financial collections, and internal sanctions, all written like business memos. Each instruction began the same way: de parte de Ronnie, from Ronnie. To his followers, that phrase meant final authority. It meant the order was law. On the outside, Ayala's influence extended into communities already drowning in addiction and violence. Entire neighborhoods were forced to pay street taxes just to operate safely. Even gangs that weren't directly aligned with Eli May had to acknowledge Ayala's reach, because refusing meant war. And while this empire flourished, Ayala himself appeared untouchable. His death sentence, which should have isolated him completely, became his armor. Prison officials treated death row inmates differently. Less movement, fewer transfers, and ironically, less scrutiny than the general population. That separation made it harder to trace his network, and it bought him time, years of it. In 2010, the California Department of Corrections launched a renewed operation, Operation Carnalismo, to dismantle the Mexican Mafia's internal communication systems. It targeted high-ranking members suspected of continuing to run criminal activity from inside. Among the top names listed, Ronaldo Ayala. Agents conducted cell raids, confiscated correspondence, and froze financial accounts linked to family members. But Ayala had prepared for this. His chain of command was layered, his communications redundant. If one route was cut, another would open within days. His organization operated like a living organism, constantly adapting. Even on death row, Ronnie Ayala played a longer game. He knew his physical life was limited, but his influence didn't have to die with him. He trained successors, mentored younger inmates, and installed loyal secretaries, outside contacts who would continue his operations under his name. For Ayala, legacy was power. Every order he wrote, every life he took, every dollar that passed through his network was a way to etch his name into the history of La Ime, and it worked. By the mid-2000s, federal indictments described Ayala not just as a gang member, but as a continuing criminal enterprise leader, a title usually reserved for cartel bosses. Prosecutors alleged he was involved in orchestrating murders, trafficking methamphetamine, and controlling extortion rackets that reached from California to Arizona. The most chilling detail? Most of it was done without him ever leaving his cell. Major decision filtered through him. Every significant gang operation in that region had his fingerprint on it. That's not supposed to be possible. But somehow he made it real behind bars. Ayala became something larger than a man. To some, he was a ghost, an untouchable myth of the Mexican Mafia. To others, he was the architect of their suffering. But to his followers, he was proof that the system could be beaten, that even a condemned man could bend the world from within a cage. As the years passed, his influence began to reach beyond gang politics. His words inspired fear across multiple prison systems. Younger inmates idolized him, not for his crimes, but for his control. He embodied what the Mexican Mafia preached: power through discipline, loyalty, and unwavering will. But the higher the empire rose, the more it drew attention. Federal task forces began tracking Ayala's network through wiretaps, informants, and flipped soldiers. Slowly, the walls began to close in. His letters became contraband. His visitors monitored. His lieutenants arrested. Yet even under relentless surveillance, Ayala refused to break. He adapted once again, switching to verbal codes during phone calls, communicating through cryptic religious references, embedding messages in artwork sent to family. For Ronnie Ayala, control was everything, and losing it was never an option. But as investigators closed in, and as internal rivalries within the Mexican Mafia began to boil, one truth became clear: power built in confinement can only last so long before it consumes itself. In the next act, the empire Ayala built would face its greatest threat, not from the outside world, but from within. Rival factions, informants, and betrayal would test the foundations of his rule and expose just how far the Mexican Mafia would go to protect its throne. For more than 3 decades, Ronnie Ayala ruled from behind bars. His words carried more weight than the warden's orders. His signature, more feared than any gang tattoo. But every empire, no matter how disciplined, carries its own cracks. And by the early 2020s, those cracks began to show. The same system that Ayala had mastered was turning against him. Federal investigators had learned to think like him, to read between the lines, to decode the silence in his communications. They began tracing financial transactions that tied street-level tax collections directly to inmate accounts connected to Ayala's network. Each payment was small, $50 here, $100 there, but together they formed a map of influence that stretched across the state. The investigators called it the Light Bill, the same name Ayala's men used to collect monthly tribute inside jails. Every inmate in San Diego County's jail system paid Ayala's tax, $50 a month, sent through Cash App to trusted associates on the outside. It was more than extortion. It was a declaration of dominance, a message that even in the digital age, the Mexican Mafia could adapt, thrive, and profit, even from a death row cell. But as his system grew more modern, so did its vulnerabilities. Technology became the doorway that law enforcement needed to finally see inside his empire. The very Cash App transactions that kept money flowing also created a digital trail, one that couldn't be hidden behind coded letters or family names. By 2024, the FBI and DEA had quietly assembled a joint task force aimed squarely at Ronnie Ayala. They called it Operation Deadline, a reference both to death row and to the communication lifelines Ayala had built. The mission: dismantle his command structure and prove that the Mexican Mafia had aligned with the Sinaloa cartel under Ayala's leadership. Tell the homies in National City, products coming north, same people, same price. La Casa approves. That was the phrase investigators had been waiting for. Inside the Mexican Mafia, La Casa, the house, meant approval from the highest authority. It meant Ronnie Ayala had spoken. In January 2025, their patience paid off. Federal prosecutors in San Diego unsealed a sweeping indictment, charging Ayala and 5 others with racketeering, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. The documents read like a blueprint of his empire: methamphetamine from Sinaloa, heroin through Baja, fentanyl in the western states, and prison networks collecting tribute under his orders. But behind the headline was something far more dangerous: betrayal. The investigation hadn't just relied on intercepted messages or financial records. It relied on voices from inside, men who had once sworn allegiance to Ayala, now turned informants. For years, Ayala had inspired fear and loyalty in equal measure. But fear doesn't last forever. And when the federal government offers freedom in exchange for confession, loyalty begins to fade. One of Ayala's former lieutenants, a man identified only as Witness 3, began feeding information to federal agents. He revealed the internal structure of Ayala's network: the street collectors, the prison enforcers, and the outside intermediaries tied to cartel liaisons. He described meetings, payments, and even orders for violence, all traced back to Ayala's name. This betrayal hit Ayala harder than any courtroom verdict, because in the world of La May, betrayal is the one crime that cannot be forgiven. Inside prison, news of the indictment spread like wildfire. Whispers filled the cell blocks. Names were being read, alliances questioned, loyalties tested. Some claimed Ayala had grown too powerful, that his alliances with the Sinaloa cartel had brought too much heat to the organization. Others believed the feds were using him as a scapegoat, a way to claim victory against an empire that could never truly be destroyed. But Ayala didn't panic. Even as the federal indictment named him as a central figure in a cartel partnership, he stayed composed. He'd survived decades of isolation, dozens of investigations, and a lifetime on death row. For him, this was just another test of endurance. Still, behind that calm exterior, there was calculation. Ayala knew that every empire eventually faces the weight of time, and he began preparing for what came next. He restructured his communication channels, distancing himself from key operations, placing loyal intermediaries in positions of control. But the government had already seen too much. When he was finally transferred from San Quentin in early 2025, following the state's decision to shut down death row, it marked the end of an era. The man who had ruled from California's most infamous prison was now in federal custody, held temporarily in Washoe County Jail in Nevada, under tight coordination with U.S. Marshals. To the system, it was just a relocation, but to the Mexican Mafia, it was a message. Their highest-ranking general had been moved, and no one knew what would happen next. Within l'AME, paranoia spread. Who talked? Who flipped? Who gave the feds enough to tie Ayala to the Sinaloa cartel? Prison walls are built from concrete, but their foundations are rumor and fear. In 2025, those foundations were shaking. Authorities say this case represents one of the most significant blows to the Mexican Mafia's infrastructure in years, not because of the arrest, but because of the internal distrust it's created. The fear of betrayal may do what decades of prison walls never could: break l'AME from the inside. The empire that Ayala had ruled for decades, an empire built on silence, was now echoing with suspicion. Every associate was a potential informant. Every call could be monitored. Every letter might be evidence. For the first time in his long reign, Ayala was not the hunter. He was the hunted. But even facing federal prosecution, Ayala refused to bend. His defense team argued that prosecutors had exaggerated his influence, that the government had built a case on myth, fear, and the infamy of the Mexican Mafia name. They pointed out that Ayala had been on death row since 1989 and had no physical access to drugs, money, or weapons. How could a man behind bars for nearly 4 decades still be the puppet master of a cross-border empire? The question lingered in the air. Was Ronnie Ayala truly the mastermind? Or had he simply become the symbol of a much larger machine? Inside the Mexican Mafia, perception is power. And as long as his name carried fear, Ayala's influence, real or imagined, would never die. But the government wasn't finished. In their eyes, the conviction wasn't just about justice. It was about finally silencing the man who had proven that even death row couldn't gauge the reach of l'AME. In February 2025, Ronnie Ayala was moved for the last time. The transfer from San Quentin's death row to a federal holding facility in Reno, Nevada, marked more than a change in custody. It marked the symbolic fall of one of the most powerful inmates in California history. For decades, Ayala had ruled from the shadows. He had turned confinement into command, silence into strategy, and fear into currency. But now, after 36 years behind bars and a lifetime of blood and control, the empire he built was collapsing under the weight of modern justice and the ghosts of his own making. Inside Washoe County Jail, Ayala was held in isolation. He had no direct access to phones, no mail privileges beyond what was monitored, no visitors except his attorney. For a man who had spent decades pulling invisible strings from within prison walls, the silence was deafening. But silence doesn't erase influence. Even as prosecutors prepared their case, Ayala's legend continued to echo through prison yards from California to Nevada. Whispers of his name carried meaning, a reminder of what l'AME once was and what it still could be. Everyone on the yard knew Ronnie ran things. Didn't matter that he was on death row. He was the shot caller, the one nobody questioned. You'd hear, "Ronnie said this," or "Ronnie taxed that crew." Whether it was true or not didn't matter. His name alone kept people in line, and that was the power Ayala left behind. Not just in what he did, but in what people believed he could still do. In court filings, federal prosecutors called Ayala's network a criminal enterprise with cartel-level efficiency. They claimed his alliance with the Sinaloa cartel had given him access to cross-border logistics, using cartel smuggling routes for drugs and weapons, while the Mexican Mafia provided prison protection and enforcement inside the United States. To the government, it was proof that Ronnie Ayala wasn't just another gang leader. He was a bridge, a living link between the Mexican Mafia and the world's most powerful drug cartel. But to l'AME, The indictment was something else entirely. It was a test. Because within the organization's iron code, leadership is never surrendered. It's taken through death, betrayal, or silence. With Ayala in federal custody and facing new charges, internal factions began to stir. Some members believed his time was over, that the organization needed new blood, younger leadership, men untouched by the old ways of control. Others swore loyalty, promising to keep the carnalismo, the brotherhood, alive in his name. This was the paradox of Ronnie Ayala's rule. Even as his empire crumbled, his myth grew stronger. He became the embodiment of La Aime's creed. Once in, never out. A man who could not be killed, even by a death sentence. In interviews, prosecutors admitted a grim truth. Even if they convicted Ayala again, even if they stripped him of every privilege, they could never truly erase his influence. Because Ayala didn't rule through presence, he ruled through reputation. He had become a symbol. And symbols don't die in prison. Still, Ayala's isolation brought one undeniable reality: time. Time to face what he had built and what it had cost. In the decades since that 1985 triple homicide, the crime that sent him to death row, more than 100 people had been killed in operations linked to La Aime's regional control. Entire generations of gang members grew up in the shadow of his rules, living, killing, and dying under his authority. But power inside a cage always comes at a price. Many of Ayala's closest allies were either dead, serving life sentences, or had turned government witnesses. The same loyalty that had built his empire had ultimately doomed it. Those who once prayed to escape his wrath now prayed for his soul. When the indictment was unsealed, it contained 22 counts, including racketeering, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and criminal enterprise participation. Each charge carried the potential for another life sentence. But for a man already living on death row, the law could offer little more than paperwork. What mattered most to the system wasn't punishment. It was message. Ayala's prosecution was meant to send a warning that no matter how powerful the organization, no one was beyond reach. No gang, no alliance, no leader could outlast the state forever. But history suggests otherwise, because every time a leader falls, another rises. And for the Mexican Mafia, whose roots go back to the 1950s, leadership is not a person, it's a pattern. Ayala's rise, his reign, and his downfall were part of that pattern, the endless cycle of violence, loyalty, and power that keeps La Aime alive. Even today, investigators say Ayala's network hasn't been fully dismantled. Fragments of his operations still operate in Southern California, paying homage to the old man on death row. His name, whispered in hushed tones, still commands respect or fear, depending on who's listening. Ronnie Ayala's life is a study in extremes: loyalty and betrayal, control and confinement, fear and faith. He was a man who turned a death sentence into a dynasty, who redefined what it meant to wield power behind bars. But in the end, his greatest achievement was also his greatest curse, proving that the Mexican Mafia's influence could never truly be contained. In the eyes of law enforcement, he remains a criminal mastermind, a cold strategist who orchestrated violence for profit. But to his followers, he's remembered as something more: the dawn of death row. The man who showed that control isn't about freedom. It's about fear and the ability to command it, even from the darkness. For Ronnie Ayala, the prison walls that were meant to end his life instead became the fortress from which he ruled it. And though his story may end in isolation, the legacy he leaves behind of power, discipline, and defiance continues to haunt every cell where the symbol of La Aime still burns.